Let me tell you a little bit more about, and let me talk a little bit more about, some of the things that are included in this notion of mind-matter interaction. It was popularized recently in a movie called The Secret. And The Secret made popular a form of it called the law of attraction, which is actually a subset of the New Thought movement. Now, the New Thought movement has been around since the late 1800s, and we'll be talking a lot about it in upcoming slides and in upcoming sessions. The basic idea behind New Thought is that what you think produces an effect on reality. So if you want to have an effect on reality, all you have to do is think things in a certain way, or maybe think and feel them in a certain way, and they will come to fruition. So it's sort of like wishing for what you want to have happen in the world and actually having it happen. There's a lot of other areas of mind-matter interaction and mind-matter interaction research, though. New Thought, the law of attraction, the secret, those are basically all in the public domain. They're very popular notions. They don't have very much research associated with them. Now we'll see that there is actually some research in them, and we'll see that both in this section and in the sessions that follow. But there are other forms of mind-matter interaction that in fact have a tremendous amount of research done on them. So you see some of them on this graphic. Power of thought is a generic catch-all term for all of these. Distant mental influence is a term that was created by William Broad and Marilyn Schlitz, and this is all academic based. It's all academic research based, and the idea was really, can you sense things like being stared at? Placebo effects you're probably very familiar with, and placebo effects are most often referred to in medicine. And the idea behind placebo effects is that the mind intervenes in a way to heal the body, right? That is usually what you see reflected when you see in the popular literature, in the mainstream literature, the idea of placebo being discussed. But actually in the academic literature and the medical literature, placebo effects really don't usually deal with whether or not someone gets better. The most well-researched placebo effects, and incidentally the other one, Psychoneuroimmunology, which is often abbreviated PNI, which you can see in the right-hand column there in the third bullet point, that's a split-off and a derivative of placebo effects. What placebo effects are normally seen, how they're normally seen in the academic world is with things like painkillers, antidepressants, as well as things like giving someone an inert substance like a sugar pill, for instance, and telling them that it will induce vomiting and actually having it induce vomiting. The reality behind placebo effects is that there's very, very little evidence of the placebo effect actually being able to use to heal things like cancer or whatever. Now, there are some instances of it, for instance, placebo surgeries, where someone may be having a form of knee surgery, as an example, and the placebo surgery might be more effective or as effective as the actual operation for that knee surgery. So there are some indications of it healing, but the way you normally think about it from a public standpoint is really not where a lot of the research lies and not where a lot of the evidence for it lies. Generally, you can affect things like mood, you can induce vomiting, you can do things like that, but it doesn't deal a lot with, getting rid of cancer. Mental rehearsal is a psychology term, very, very research-driven, and it's primarily seen in the area of sports psychology. And what it primarily deals with is having someone, let's say you're a downhill skier, having you actually visualize a ski run in your mind, having you do it in real time. It's not as effective if you slow it down or speed up your visualization. So you want to visualize it in real time, and basically being able to actually produce effects that are performance related from this type of activity. So being able to very accurately visualize yourself going on a specific downhill course, and actually having that increase your performance on that course. There's also some interesting things on strengthening muscles. So you can get, for instance, maybe a 20 to 30% increase in strengthening muscles by simply visualizing exercises that are designed to do that for specific muscle groups. So that's another example of a little bit of mind-matter interaction that has been very well documented in the sports psychology, and as you might imagine, is used by major athletes. It's often the difference at an Olympic athlete level, where you have, a range of people that are of similar physical ability, and you need to have some sort of edge over your competitor. Prayer effectiveness is another one that has been academically researched. I think in the popular literature, Larry Dossey, as an example, popularized the idea of the power of prayer and the effectiveness of prayer. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in an upcoming graphic. The psychology of luck is another very interesting area that relates to this sort of question of whether or not you can have an impact on reality. We'll be looking more at it in depth in later session. Synchronicity is an academic term as well as a public term. You see it used by people who have taken a more philosophical, in most cases, examination. Synchronicity doesn't really have a lot of actual scientific study behind it. It's used more along the lines of academics that are doing more theoretical driven inquiries into this type of mind-matter interaction. But you do see it. Major academics like Alan Combs probably has written the best book on it. A physicist named David Peat, who we'll be mentioning very shortly, has also written a book on it. So there are some very serious academics, very solid academics, very serious thinkers that have done writing in this area of mind-matter interaction, and they refer to it as synchronicity. Psychokinesis is what the parapsychology community refers to mind-matter interaction as. So it's you being able to directly create some sort of impact in reality using your mind. Now, parapsychology has sort of a bad name in mainstream psychology, but one of the things that you notice when you look into it is that these people really try very, very hard to conduct rigorous scientific studies. And in fact, they're the ones who invented the gold standard of scientific studies, which is randomized, very heavily controlled and blinded trials. And it's because their work was just so massively attacked. So their efforts are often more rigorous than other areas of science, which is kind of an irony there, because they're still so heavily attacked. Well, so anyway, there is some evidence within parapsychology of this effect of psychokinesis. Psychoimmunology, we talked about, it relates to the placebo effect. And it's actually a learning effect, it seems. It was done with some animal trials where, for example, you might inject a substance in them that produced a certain effect. So it might have a stimulant effect, as an example. And you might pair that with something. So you might have a stimulus and response type of effect. You might pair that with a certain researcher. You might pair it with a certain environmental sound or light, something along those lines. And then when you later produce that stimulus, that sound, that light, that researcher in a certain context, whatever, the same effect, the same stimulus or depressive or whatever, maybe pain-killing, whatever effect is produced, but without the actual drug, without the actual substance that would produce that being injected or being given to the animal. The last one here, mental force. This is a term from a section of the neuroscience community. You can find it in a popular book by Jeffrey Schwartz, which was called The Mind and the Brain. And there's this interesting revolution that's basically happened in neuroscience in recent years with the advent of something called functional magnetic resonance imaging, which allows you to actually see changes in the brain as they're occurring. Up until the last decade or so, it was relative orthodoxy within neuroscience that your brain was relatively fixed after a certain year, that there wasn't a lot of neuroplasticity as you went through and lived your life. And functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is abbreviated fMRI, really changed this and flipped the argument substantially. So if you go back to 100 years or so ago, there's a lot of argument among people that were involved in early neuroscience as to whether or not there was a lot of plasticity in the brain, neuroplasticity in the brain, a lot of change that could take place in different stages of life. And for many, many decades, the fixed group, the group that argued that there wasn't a lot of change that was possible, really held sway. Well, because of fMRI, it's really become undeniable that our brains are constantly changing, that they're changing all the time. And Jeffrey Schwartz made an argument in The Mind and the Brain and also in his academic work, he's at UCLA, he's a research professor at UCLA, that there's some sort of mental force that is changing our brain, that in essence what we think and what we feel produces tangible physiological brain changes. Which, if you think about it, is not too far off from an argument that you see in things like the New Thought movement. So it's absolutely sort of falls into this overall idea of mind-matter interaction. So having given you just a little bit of an overview, and we could have talked about a lot more things, I could have put a lot more stuff on this slide, I really want to now draw some distinctions. And the most important distinction is really between biological and non-biological based mind-matter interaction. What you see is that there's no shortage of evidence for things like mental force, for things like certain placebo effects, psychoneuroimmunology. These are even mental rehearsal. These are things that are mind-matter interaction, but they're really mind-body interaction. They're biological interactions, basically within you as an individual. So there are changes that you can make within you as an individual. And we'll extend this out and we'll see that it also relates to the psychology of luck. It relates to New Thought. It relates to law of attraction. It relates to the idea of a secret. It relates to the idea of synchronicity, to power of thought. But it's changes that you're making in your own life, in your own physiology, in your own thoughts, in your own emotions. And from that, there are changes that are rippling out in your awareness, in your biology, etc. from there. Now that's very different than a non-biological form of power of thought or a non-biological form of mind-matter interaction where the insistence might be that you can visualize getting a new house and have it come into your being, come into your reality. That you can visualize getting a great parking spot, for instance, and have that manifest in outer reality. So this is a very important distinction to draw. The reality is that there is an enormous amount of academic and scientific evidence towards biological-based mind-matter interaction, and almost no evidence towards non-biological based interaction. Now that's very different than what you've probably heard and read about. If you're familiar with things like The Secret, if you've done a lot of reading on things like New Thought and law of attraction, it's very, very likely that you've been told that there's an enormous amount of scientific evidence that supports things like you can manifest, the house of your dreams by simply wishing for it in a certain way, by certainly visualizing it, by just visualizing it in a certain way, or a parking spot by visualizing it in a certain way, etc. Right? I want to go through and look at what may be some examples that you commonly heard in your perusing of the public literature in this area.